On July 14, 2025, the quiet village of Amur Krai stirred awake under heavy gray skies, where the lone clinic stood as the only medical point for miles. Among the familiar faces of the community was Sergei Malenkov, a local officer who carried the weight of duty with quiet resolve. Known for helping neighbors in emergencies, he had grown up in this rugged land where wild animals and people often lived side by side. Years in service had taught him caution, yet he was also marked by a deep sense of responsibility. That morning he accompanied a patient toward the modest hospital, never suspecting that fate would draw him into one of the most violent tragedies the settlement had ever faced. The building itself was small, with narrow halls and a single reception area where staff moved quickly between tasks. Outside, the noise of construction equipment echoed as workers repaired pipes, while a delivery truck unloaded supplies near the side entrance. The mixture of food scents, loud activity, and unusual commotion carried into the nearby trees. Within the shadows of that forest lurked a giant grizzly, unsettled and driven by instinct. Its powerful frame shifted forward, following the aroma of goods and the disturbance that broke the normal silence of the land. The heavy door burst open with startling force as the beast pushed inside, glass splintering and wooden frames breaking apart, papers scattered like snowflakes while cabinets rattled from the impact. The waiting area became a storm of confusion as screams filled the air. The creature's immense weight smashed the reception desk, sending pens, charts, and medicines across the floor. For a brief instant, the staff froze in disbelief before panic spread through every corner. Sergei's focus remained fixed on shielding the patient at his side. As the predator advanced, its massive paw swung with bone-crushing power, pinning him against the wall. The sound of claws tearing through cloth and flesh cut across the chaos, leaving his body marked with deep punctures and torn muscle. Blood spread across his uniform, while broken ribs cracked under the brute force of repeated swipes. Despite the unbearable pain, he struggled to keep the attention away from those still fleeing into the safety of side rooms. The injured patient stumbled clear as Sergei's final efforts held the animal's fury. The grizzly reared high, roaring through the narrow space, its breath steaming against the walls. Furniture toppled, cabinets splintered, and the crash of falling objects echoed through the hall. Staff and frightened villagers slammed doors shut, turning exam rooms into barricaded shelters. Inside those makeshift strongholds, trembling hands held back tears as the roars shook their fragile walls. In those few moments, the modest hospital was transformed into a battleground. Sergei's strength began to fade as the claws carved into his chest, his body collapsing under the relentless attack. The building shuddered from the clash of beast against man, while the air filled with cries, breaking glass, and the raw thunder of nature unleashed. The fight seemed endless, until an unexpected sound outside began to shift the balance. The deep growls and heavy stomps inside the building faltered, when the harsh pounding of machinery from the worksite outside cut through the air. The metallic grind and steady hammering echoed across the walls, clashing with the bear's roars. The predator hesitated, its head snapping toward the unfamiliar vibrations. For several tense seconds, the massive figure moved in a restless circle, claws raking across the tile, before turning toward the broken entrance. With a final crash against a toppled chair, the animal pushed its way back through the shattered doorway and lumbered into the forest. What remained in the aftermath was a silence broken only by shallow breaths and muffled cries behind locked doors. The waiting room was a ruin, its furniture smashed, walls marked with blood, and glass fragments crunching under every step. Nurses and villagers emerged slowly, their faces pale, as they gathered near the motionless body slumped against the wall. Sergei lay where the beast had left him, his chest torn and his eyes closed, his final act marked by the shield he had provided for the others. The patient he had guided into safety clutched the doorframe, unable to speak as shock spread across the room. Word of the attack traveled quickly through the settlement. Men and women who had known Sergei since childhood crowded the small clinic, their grief mixing with fear. For many, he had been a figure of trust, often the first to answer when trouble called. His passing left a hollow silence that echoed louder than the construction noises still rumbling beyond the trees. The workers who had unknowingly saved lives with their machinery now stood in disbelief, realizing the terror their presence had ended. Authorities arrived later, inspecting the damage and marking claw marks on doors, desks, and even the floor tiles. Wildlife officers explained that bears in this region often grew more aggressive during late summer, when human activity and food storage attracted them closer to villages. The combination of fresh supplies, loud building work, and open entrances had created the perfect storm. Still, no one in the village had expected such violence within the walls of their hospital, a place once seen as untouchable by the wilderness around it. Funeral preparations began within hours, candles placed near the clinic as neighbors gathered in silence. The memory of Sergei's final stand became a story repeated among families, told not with fear, but with respect for the man who gave his strength to protect another. Doctors and nurses, though shaken, returned to their posts, cleaning the destroyed reception area and restoring order where chaos had spread. Broken cabinets were nailed shut, shattered windows covered with boards, and alarms checked more carefully than ever before. In the days that followed, experts from larger cities visited to advise the community on safety measures, warning that as forests shrink and food grows scarce, bears may push further into human spaces. For the people of Amur Krai, the hospital attack stood as a reminder that survival in remote lands was not only about enduring the cold and distance, but also about living beside untamed giants. Sergei's sacrifice remained carved into the memory of the village, a story of bravery born in the most fragile of places. On October 14, 2025, the early morning air in Montana was crisp and heavy with silence. Emmett Harlow, a seasoned outdoorsman, had spent years exploring the rugged wilderness that stretched across the mountains and valleys. Born and raised in a small town nearby, he had grown up learning to hunt, fish, and survive in the wild. His reputation among locals was that of a skilled tracker who respected nature deeply. Though experienced, he was never careless. Emmett often reminded others that the wild was both beautiful and unpredictable. That morning, he parked his worn pickup truck along a remote trail, planning another long hunt in familiar country. The back of the vehicle carried supplies, gear, and bait he would use later in the day. As the first light broke over the tree line, Emmett moved slowly, unloading equipment and checking his rifle. The forest around him seemed calm, with only the faint rustle of leaves in the wind breaking the stillness. What he did not realize was that the faint scent of bait resting in the open truck bed had traveled far. From deep within the trees, a massive grizzly had caught the smell and wandered closer. With each step, its heavy paws pressed into the soil, silent yet purposeful, until the towering animal reached the clearing where the truck stood. Before Emmett could turn, the bear surged forward with tremendous force. It slammed into the side of the truck, the sound of metal twisting echoing across the trail. The driver's side door crumpled under the weight, and glass from the windows shattered into shards that scattered across the dirt. The pickup rocked violently, its frame dented and bent as if it were made of thin tin. Supplies spilled from the bed, tumbling onto the ground as the beast clawed furiously at the cab. Emmett instinctively tried to back away, but the bear's speed was overwhelming. With one powerful swipe, its claws ripped across his chest and shoulder, tearing through clothing and skin in a single strike. Pain shot through his body as ribs cracked under the force. He stumbled backward, breath stolen from his lungs, while blood began to soak his shirt. The grizzly roared, rearing back before striking again, its paw leaving fresh wounds along his torso. Desperate and struggling to remain on his feet, Emmett reached for the knife at his side. As the bear lunged once more, he thrust the blade forward with every ounce of strength he had left. The sharp steel pierced the animal's thick hide, surprising it and forcing it to hesitate. Its momentum faltered for just a moment, and that moment saved his life. Gritting his teeth, he slashed again, pushing the beast back just enough to create space. Seizing the brief chance, Emmett dragged himself into the dense woods nearby. His movements were slow and strained, each step leaving a trail of blood on the earth. Behind him, the bear remained near the wrecked truck, circling and growling, but no longer pressing forward. Emmett clutched his side, fighting to stay conscious, his only thought now focused on survival. He stumbled deeper into the cover of the forest, every step burning with pain. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his vision blurred from the loss of blood. The sharp edges of branches scraped against his skin as he tried to stay hidden. Behind him, the grizzly circled the battered truck, sniffing and pacing, but the lure of food kept it distracted. The hunter pressed onward, guided only by instinct and the need to endure. His body felt heavier with each passing moment, yet his will to keep moving forced his legs forward. The dense trees finally gave way to a small ridge where he collapsed to the ground. His clothes were torn, soaked with dark stains spreading across the fabric. He fought to remain conscious, forcing himself to wave his arm toward the open sky, hoping someone might see movement. Hours felt like days as he lay there, the cold air tightening around him. But luck turned when a distant hiker caught sight of the wrecked truck and raised the alarm. Rescue crews were alerted, and within time, a helicopter roared above the valley. Medics rushed to Emmett's side, lifting him carefully onto a stretcher. His injuries were severe, with broken bones and deep gashes across his chest and shoulder. Every bump of the stretcher made him groan, yet relief washed over him as the helicopter lifted away from the wilderness that had nearly claimed his life. The flight carried him swiftly to a regional hospital, where surgeons worked tirelessly through the night. Hours of surgery followed as doctors closed wounds, stabilized fractures, and treated internal bleeding. The fight to keep him alive was just as fierce as the struggle he had faced in the woods. News of the attack spread quickly through the nearby towns. Residents were shaken. Many who knew Emmett personally felt a mix of fear and respect for the wild animals that lived so close to human settlements. Authorities examined the damaged truck, its sides dented and glass shattered, as a stark reminder of the force the Grizzly had unleashed. Wildlife officers patrolled the area to track the bear, warning hunters and hikers to stay cautious until the animal moved away from human trails. Weeks passed as Emmett remained in recovery. His chest bore long scars, and his ribs took months to heal. Physical therapy became part of his daily routine, helping him regain strength in his arms and shoulders. Pain lingered, but he refused to let it keep him from standing again. Friends and family visited often, bringing encouragement and stories to lift his spirits. Though he had faced the jaws of death, his determination never faded. Experts later explained how human activity, even in familiar hunting grounds, can attract bears when food sources are left unattended. The shredded truck served as evidence of what happens when nature collides with human presence. Emmett's survival was seen as a rare victory against impossible odds, and his story became a warning for anyone venturing into the wild. On July 14, 2025, Ronan Mercer, a skilled outdoorsman with years of paddling experience, set out on a solo journey through a winding gorge in Montana. Since his teenage years, he had grown attached to the wilderness, often traveling alone into remote rivers and lakes to capture moments of peace and beauty. He was not only a kayaker, but also a photographer who believed the water carried secrets worth recording. Known by friends as patient and careful, he trained himself to respect wild terrain and always carried safety equipment. His life jacket, paddle, and a small emergency kit were part of his routine, along with knowledge of currents and weather shifts. Although no stranger to challenges, he had never faced what was waiting for him on that summer day. The narrow gorge he entered was alive with echoes of rushing water, its banks littered with branches and fish remains carried down from earlier storms. The sound of paddles dipping into cold currents blended with the cries of distant birds circling the cliffs. The air was sharp and filled with the scent of moss and wet stone. Ronan steered carefully between jagged rocks, his kayak gliding smoothly across the surface. Unseen by him, a powerful grizzly lingered near the shore, drawn by the smell of salmon carcasses scattered along the riverbank. The animal's size and strength were immense, and its presence turned the calm setting into a hidden danger. Without warning, the beast surged from the side, charging down the bank with force that shook the ground. Before Ronan could react, the bear's paw slammed into his kayak, splintering plastic and sending shards into the river. The impact flipped the vessel, throwing him into the freezing water. The shock of the cold nearly stole his breath, but there was no time to recover. Claws ripped across his jacket, tearing fabric and scraping his ribs beneath. Each strike carried the weight of survival against unstoppable strength. He fought to stay afloat as the current pushed him into rocks sharp enough to cut through skin. With desperate effort, Ronan clutched his paddle, holding it across his chest like a shield. The grizzly lunged again, swiping with enough power to jolt his body back under the surface. He gasped for air between strikes, blood from fresh gashes staining the current around him. His arms and shoulders throbbed with pain as deep wounds opened, but he forced the paddle upward each time the bear closed in. Every second felt stretched, as if time itself had slowed to measure his struggle against overwhelming odds. The gorge amplified every sound: the roar of the beast, the crack of broken plastic, the splash of his frantic movements. The fight dragged on through minutes that seemed endless. The rushing water carried fragments of the kayak downstream, while the battle between man and animal raged in the heart of the icy current. What followed tested every ounce of his endurance and threatened to decide if he would survive the river that tried to claim him. The struggle carried on until the roar of breaking stone echoed above. A sheet of loose rock collapsed from the cliff, tumbling into the river with a crash. The sudden noise startled the grizzly, sending ripples of hesitation through its charge. For a moment, the predator stepped back, its wet fur glistening in the light as it weighed the threat of the falling debris. That pause gave Ronan a chance to push toward the edge of the river, his body trembling with exhaustion. Every muscle screamed as he dragged himself across slippery stones, his paddle still clutched in a bleeding hand. The cold water clung to his clothing, pulling heat from his body with alarming speed. His vision blurred, and each breath cut deeper into his lungs. He stumbled onto a patch of uneven ground, leaving streaks of red across sharp rocks. The bear prowled at a distance, still restless, but no longer lunging forward. Splashes from the falling rubble seemed to unsettle it, while Ronan's frantic movements added confusion to the moment. At last, the animal turned back toward the bank, growling as it retreated into the cover of trees, leaving only silence behind. Ronan collapsed on the gravel, barely conscious, his life jacket torn nearly to shreds. His arms and shoulders burned from deep wounds. His chest ached from bruises, and his ribs throbbed as if struck by hammers. The freezing current had drained nearly all his strength. Yet with sheer determination, he forced himself to crawl higher up the riverbank. Each motion was slow and deliberate, his body shaking from blood loss and the cold pressing against his skin. The once peaceful gorge was now marked by splintered plastic, smeared trails, and the aftermath of a fight few could endure. The sound of rushing water blended with the distant calls of birds, masking his weak gasps. Ronan waved his bright paddle toward the sky, hoping for any sign of help. His hand trembled violently, but the orange blade glinted in the sun, cutting through the wilderness with a faint signal. Hours seemed to drag, but his effort did not go unseen. A search helicopter, conducting a routine survey of the region, spotted the unusual flash and circled lower. The crew quickly realized the seriousness of the scene below. Rescuers descended, moving swiftly to secure him before his fading strength gave way. They applied first aid, stabilizing his injuries as best they could, then lifted him aboard for evacuation. His eyes fluttered shut, but not before he recognized the hum of the machine as a sign of survival. In the days that followed, doctors confirmed the extent of his wounds: several deep cuts, a broken rib, and frostbite from prolonged exposure. Surgeries repaired torn muscle, while treatment addressed severe shock and hypothermia. News of the event spread quickly, becoming a striking reminder of the dangers rivers conceal when predators roam close to food sources. Wildlife experts explain that grizzlies in salmon-fed regions often act with fierce aggression. Ronan's case showed that even the most prepared adventurer can be caught in a storm of survival within seconds. His persistence, matched with the fortune of timely rescue, transformed a near-fatal encounter into a lasting story of endurance in one of nature's harshest landscapes. In late September 2024, Thatcher Rowland moved silently along a narrow ridge on a remote Alaskan island, the crisp morning air carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint tang of salt from the distant ocean. An experienced hunter with decades of wilderness survival under his belt, Thatcher had come to this isolated part of Alaska in search of elk, drawn by the quiet solitude and the challenge of tracking animals across rugged terrain. The slopes were steep, scattered with granite outcrops and thick spruce that twisted around the rocky ground, creating shadows that shifted as the wind stirred the trees. His loyal Malamute, Coda, trotted a few steps behind him, alert to every sound and scent, a steady presence in the otherwise empty wilderness. Thatcher moved carefully, eyes scanning the ridge for movement, his rifle slung across his back, his mind balancing between focus on the hunt and respect for the dangers that lurked where humans rarely ventured. The day was calm, the sky painted in soft hues of gold and crimson as the sun climbed slowly over the horizon, brushing the peaks with warmth. Thatcher spotted fresh elk tracks winding along the ridge and crouched low, moving as quietly as possible over loose gravel and roots. The rhythm of his breathing matched the slow, deliberate steps of Coda at his side. The dog's ears perked and tail low, signaling attention and readiness. For a while, the ridge seemed tranquil, the only sounds the distant crash of surf against rocky cliffs and the occasional call of a seabird. Thatcher had hunted in Alaska for years and had long ago learned that peace in the wild could be deceptive, a thin veil over the constant presence of predators far larger and faster than any human. Without warning, a massive bear burst from behind a rock outcrop, its bulk nearly doubling the size of any man. Drawn by the elk scent Thatcher had been following, the animal charged with terrifying speed, claws scraping stone and soil as it closed the distance. Thatcher's instincts screamed to raise his rifle, but panic struck first. The weapon jammed the instant he tried to fire, the mechanism refusing to respond as the bear's momentum drove him backward. He felt the wind knocked out of him. His body hurled to the rocky ground, and the world narrowed to a blur of brown fur, flashing claws, and the crushing weight that landed across his chest. Pain exploded through his ribs and torso as the bear swiped, tearing deep gashes into his side and knocking the breath from him, each exhalation a struggle against the pressure of the paw pinning him to the earth. Coda leapt forward with a growl that split the morning air, his teeth sinking into the bear's muzzle and drawing a startled roar of frustration and anger. The predator swatted at the dog, momentarily distracted, but Thatcher, struggling to remain conscious, understood that every second counted. His vision blurred with blood and sweat, his hands scraping against stone as he tried to shield himself from the next blow. Each movement was agony, every breath a battle with pain and the crushing weight of fear. Yet even then, the instincts that had carried him through countless hunts guided him to protect Coda, the companion who had saved his life as much as any weapon could have. The bear hesitated, shifting its weight as Coda clamped down again, growling with defiance. It seemed uncertain, caught between its predatory drive and surprise at the dog's audacity. That hesitation gave Thatcher the opening to crawl toward a jagged rock that offered some protection. Each inch forward was fought through searing pain, torn muscles, broken ribs, and punctured skin pulling him closer to collapse. His vision dimmed, black edges creeping inward, but he refused to surrender. Coda stayed close, growling and snapping whenever the animal moved, his courage a living shield that moved faster and fiercer than Thatcher could have hoped. At last, the bear retreated, vanishing into the brush with a final frustrated roar. The sounds of splintering branches and crashing undergrowth faded, leaving only the heavy scent of blood and the sharp memory of survival. Thatcher lay gasping, ribs crushed, and a lung collapsed, his body battered and broken yet still alive. Coda nudged him gently, whining, aware of the danger yet unwilling to leave his side. Thatcher, barely able to move, reached for his emergency radio, his hands slick with blood as he signaled for help. Relief mingled with disbelief in his mind as he realized how narrowly he had survived one of Alaska's largest and most formidable predators. Rescue teams arrived within the hour, guided by Thatcher's faint signals and the sharp yelp of Coda, who refused to leave his side even as medics stabilized his injuries. Every touch sent pain rippling through his body, but Thatcher was conscious enough to recognize the precision of their care, the splints, the oxygen mask, and the careful lift into a helicopter bound for the mainland. Coda rode with him, tense but loyal, never once straying, the bond between man and dog a thread of resilience woven through the chaos. In the days and weeks that followed, Thatcher's story spread as a stark reminder of the unpredictable dangers of Alaska's wilderness, a narrative of survival shaped by human endurance, canine loyalty, and the raw power of apex predators. Officials emphasized the importance of respecting these habitats, stressing that even skilled hunters could face mortal danger if caught off guard. Details of Thatcher's injuries, crushed ribs, torn muscles, and a punctured lung were shared sparingly to protect both his privacy and the dignity of the animal. Even so, the event stood as a vivid reminder of how thin the margin between life and death could be in the wild. Thatcher's recovery was slow and grueling, marked by rehabilitation, physical therapy, and the painstaking rebuilding of strength. Each step forward carried with it the memory of the encounter, an unshakable awareness of the power that had nearly ended his life. Yet alongside that memory lived gratitude for the medics, for his survival, and above all, for Coda. The dog's loyalty and instinctive courage had turned the tide in the wilderness, a reminder that survival often depends not only on human skill, but on the bonds forged between people and the animals who stand beside them. In July 2025, Elliot Carrington moved carefully along a steep trail in a national park in Alberta, the dense forest stretching around him in deep shades of green and gold beneath the warm summer sun. Elliot, an experienced hiker with years of backcountry treks behind him, carried a sturdy backpack filled with water, food, a first aid kit, and a compact camera, intending to capture the beauty of the rugged landscape. His boots crunched over loose gravel, tangled roots, and fallen pine needles as he descended a narrow slope, eyes scanning the trail for obstacles and ears attuned to the soft sounds of the forest. The rustle of leaves in the wind, the occasional call of a distant bird, and the steady murmur of a brook flowing over stones. The air hung warm and slightly damp, carrying the faint, sweet aroma of wildflowers mixed with the richer scent of earth and moss, a reminder that even in the height of summer, the wilderness remained unpredictable and very much alive. As he rounded a bend, Elliot spotted sudden movement near a patch of berries. A brown bear was busy rooting through bushes, its massive shoulders rippling beneath dark fur as it searched for food. For a moment he froze, noting how the bear seemed focused on the fruit and assuming it was distracted enough to allow a closer approach. His instincts urged caution, yet the lure of capturing a perfect photograph was too strong to resist. Stepping carefully closer, he tried to minimize noise, camera raised in anticipation of capturing the animal mid-forage. But the bear was far more aware than he realized. Its ears twitched, nostrils flaring as it caught his scent, and in an instant its attention snapped toward him. Without warning, the brown bear charged, its powerful legs propelling it across the open ground with astonishing speed, the underbrush snapping beneath its weight. Elliot barely had time to react before the animal slammed him against a nearby tree with bone-crushing force. The impact left him gasping, his breath stolen by pain, as massive claws tore through his backpack and shredded his jacket. Deep lacerations opened across his chest, cutting into muscle and skin, while several ribs fractured under the relentless pressure of its swipes. Blood poured over his hands and forearms as he struggled to remain conscious, the world narrowing to the immediate terror of motion, pain, and the desperate instinct to survive. Every attempt to crawl uphill toward safety was met with renewed swipes from the bear. Its powerful paws raked across his back, arms and legs, leaving fresh wounds and reminding him with every strike how quickly a human could become prey when distance and animal behavior were misjudged. Elliot's vision blurred with blood and sweat, pain radiating from his chest in waves that threatened to knock him unconscious. Despite the severity of his injuries, he forced himself into small, deliberate movements, inching toward a denser patch of trees where the trunks might provide partial cover and a momentary barrier against the bear's relentless assault. In the distance, other hikers noticed the chaos, their voices carrying faintly across the trail as they scrambled to respond. One of them fumbled with flares, managing to ignite them, and waved the bright sparks toward the bear in a desperate attempt to draw its attention and force it to retreat. The sudden light startled the animal, causing it to hesitate and glance toward the new threat, its growls low and guttural as it assessed the situation. Elliot used this fleeting distraction to crawl faster, dragging himself over roots and rocks, each movement a punishing challenge against the waves of pain that threatened to consume him. His arms shook, hands slick with blood, but determination and the basic drive to survive pushed him onward. Finally, the bear, unnerved by the flare and the growing presence of multiple humans, retreated into the brush, its massive form disappearing among the trees with a final low roar that echoed through the canyon. Elliot collapsed onto the ground, gasping and trembling, his body battered and bloodied, the shock of the attack mingling with the relief of temporary safety. Other hikers rushed to his side, offering immediate support and contacting emergency services, their voices tense with both concern and adrenaline as they waited for trained personnel to arrive. Elliot could barely move, his ribs cracked and lungs aching, yet he understood he had survived a situation that had escalated in seconds from curiosity into life-threatening danger. Paramedics arrived swiftly, assessing the extent of his injuries, applying emergency care on site, and preparing him for transport to a hospital equipped to handle severe trauma. Every movement was carefully controlled to prevent further damage to fractured ribs, torn muscles, and deep lacerations. Elliot, though in intense pain, remained aware enough to understand the narrow margin that had allowed him to survive. Surgery was necessary to repair the damage to his chest, remove debris from wounds, and stabilize broken bones, beginning a long process of healing that would extend over months and demand both physical endurance and patience. In the aftermath, investigators noted that even careful hikers could inadvertently trigger defensive reactions from territorial brown bears, particularly during summer when food sources such as berry patches attracted these massive animals. Safety guidelines were reinforced, emphasizing the need to maintain distance, avoid sudden movements, and carry deterrents or bear spray when venturing into backcountry areas. Elliot's recovery was slow and difficult. He endured weeks of limited mobility and a careful regimen designed to restore strength while protecting his healing ribs. Yet he carried with him a profound awareness of the fragility of human presence in the wild, an understanding reinforced by the bear's sudden charge and the overwhelming force of nature that had transformed a peaceful hike into a desperate struggle for survival. The trail where the attack occurred eventually returned to quiet once the bear moved on, the berry patch gradually regaining its natural rhythm. Yet the memory of that day, the sight of the bear, the crushing impact against the tree, the waves of pain and adrenaline, and the narrow escape remained vivid for Elliot. The wilderness was no longer just a place of beauty to him, but also one of immense power, risk, and respect. On July 9th, 2025, the quiet town of Kodiak, Alaska, carried on with its usual rhythm at a small roadside fuel stop, where families, workers, and travelers often gathered. Among the people present that day were longtime residents and passers-by simply looking to fill their tanks or grab quick supplies. Some were regulars who knew the staff well, while others were strangers passing through on their way to the harbor. The workers inside, including young clerks stacking shelves and an older cashier behind the counter, kept the station in order as the steady flow of customers came and went. The building itself was modest, lined with coolers and snack aisles, its automatic doors sliding open with every arrival. Outside, pumps clicked steadily as cars refueled under the bright summer sky. For those present, it felt like any ordinary moment in a community accustomed to both the beauty and risks of living in bear country. Without warning, the calm was shattered when a massive Kodiak bear emerged from the nearby woods, drawn by the strong smell of food and lingering fuel in the air. The sheer size of the animal dwarfed the doorway, its weight cracking the frame as it surged forward with unstoppable force. Glass exploded as the sliding doors burst apart, raining shards across the floor. The impact shook the aisles, sending bottles tumbling and shelves swaying violently. In seconds, what had been a normal stop for groceries and fuel turned into chaos as the bear pushed through, swiping at anything in its path. Papers flew, displays collapsed, and the building filled with the heavy sound of claws scraping against metal and tile. 6 customers were caught in the sudden violence. One man barely had time to react before the animal's paw raked across his arm, leaving long open wounds and knocking him to the ground. Another was slammed against a wall so hard the shelves behind him splintered. A third was cornered near the refrigerators, his leg torn open as he tried desperately to shield himself. Each swipe of the bear left trails of blood, deep cuts, and broken bones. A younger woman tripped in her rush to escape and was dragged briefly along the floor before the beast shifted toward another target. Behind the counter, a customer attempting to duck for cover found himself pinned as the desk cracked beneath the force of the animal pressing down. The air filled with screams and the shrill wail of alarms as employees scrambled to trigger every emergency system they could. The creature growled fiercely, its roars echoing louder than the sirens. Shards of glass and scattered goods littered the ground, making every step dangerous for those trying to move. One staff member grabbed a canister of deterrent spray and released a cloud, forcing the animal to recoil for only a moment before it struck again, smashing through a row of products and hurling debris across the store. Customers scrambled for cover behind aisles and counters, their hearts racing as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours, the bear's looming shadow dominating the ruined station. The chaos pressed on until a group of workers seized whatever tools they could to force the giant animal away from the trapped people. Fire extinguishers hissed as white spray filled the air, mixing with smoke from a broken alarm system. The loud blare of car horns outside carried through the shattered walls, and the heavy noise made the animal hesitate. In that pause, several victims were dragged behind counters and aisles to safety by others still able to move. With another furious roar, the bear smashed one last display of supplies, then turned sharply toward the broken entrance. Its broad frame forced through the doors, leaving splintered glass and twisted metal in its wake. Seconds later, the massive figure vanished into the trees beyond the lot, disappearing as suddenly as it had arrived. Yet the silence it left behind carried more weight than its roars. The damage was immense. 6 people were left wounded, their clothes torn and skin marked by deep gashes. One lay near the pumps outside, ribs fractured and face pale from shock. Another clutched a ruined arm, bleeding heavily as others wrapped whatever cloth they could find to slow the loss. Across the room, a woman with torn legs tried to sit upright, struggling to breathe steadily. A man pulled from behind the counter gasped through broken ribs, his chest rising and falling in short, painful bursts. Others lay scattered on the floor, bruised and bloodied, each one trying to endure the agony until help arrived. Pools of red stained the tiles, and every step echoed with crunching glass and fallen debris. Rescue crews reached the site soon after alarms alerted nearby authorities. Paramedics rushed inside, stepping carefully over wreckage while assessing the survivors. The injured were stabilized with bandages, tourniquets, and oxygen masks before being lifted onto stretchers. Sirens wailed again as ambulances carried them toward the local hospital, where surgeons prepared for hours of work. Broken bones required steel plates, torn muscles demanded stitching, and blood transfusions were given to those who had lost too much strength. Although every person attacked lived through the ordeal, the recovery ahead would demand months of therapy and repeated surgeries. Outside, wildlife officers arrived with rifles and tracking gear, searching the forest for the massive predator. Experts explained that animals of such size rarely approached human structures unless drawn by strong sense of food or unusual curiosity. The incident highlighted how dangerous a meeting with such a powerful creature could become in mere moments. Reports noted that the bear's behavior was not strictly predatory, but driven by opportunity, making it unpredictable and extremely dangerous in crowded areas. In the following weeks, new rules were placed around local stations and stores. Garbage bins were reinforced, food deliveries were secured more tightly, and noise alarms were installed to scare away curious animals. Residents spoke about the horror of that afternoon for months afterward, remembering the screams, the crashing glass, and the sight of a creature so powerful that nothing seemed able to stop it. The people injured carried scars both on their bodies and in their minds, but their survival stood as proof of quick action and determination to endure against overwhelming force. On October 14, 2024, the frozen air of northern Canada carried the sharp sting of wind across a sea of white ice. Elsa Thorson had built her life around the extremes of wild places. She was a photographer who had spent years traveling across frozen coasts, documenting animals few people would ever see up close. Born to a family of sailors in Norway, she grew up with the call of the sea and the sound of storms. Later, she pursued the silence of glaciers and the sight of great northern predators. Each expedition hardened her, yet also carried risk, for the land she loved held both beauty and danger. This journey placed her alongside a helicopter crew, tasked with delivering supplies to an isolated research base, surrounded by endless sheets of ice. Her work required long hours of waiting, often in freezing temperatures, with little separation between her and the creatures that ruled the Arctic. The day began with the steady beat of rotor blades slicing through pale skies as the aircraft lowered toward the drop zone. Snow swirled in circles around the landing site, where stacked crates of fuel, food, and tools were lowered onto the frozen ground. Elsa moved among the crew, camera in hand, trying to capture the stark contrast of human machinery set against untouched wilderness. But in the stillness beyond the whirling noise, a figure watched. Hidden within a snowdrift, a massive polar bear lingered, drawn by the scent of stored goods and the promise of easy calories at the edge of survival season. The animal moved with quiet power, its white coat blending into the terrain. Few noticed until it closed the distance in sudden bursts of speed. Without warning, the predator surged forward, its bulk crashing across the ice. Elsa, turning to adjust her lens, found herself at the center of the charge. The paw of the bear struck her hip and shoulder with shocking force, the impact tearing through the thick layers of her insulated jacket. Pain radiated across her side as she fell onto the slick surface, her back scraping harshly against frozen ridges. The bear's growl filled the air as crew members scattered across the supply field in panic. Elsa rolled, struggling to regain her balance, but the weight of her injuries slowed every motion. The animal circled, swiping at her legs with claws that carved shallow lines into her clothing and skin. The ice beneath her offered no grip, and each attempt to rise only slid her closer to danger. Her camera clattered onto the ground, forgotten in the urgency of survival. Reaching for the emergency kit strapped to her belt, Elsa tore free a flare. With trembling hands she fired, and a burst of light split the gloom. The bright flash startled the bear, forcing it back for a moment. Its eyes narrowed, unsettled by the glare, but hunger and instinct soon pulled it forward again. It lowered its head and advanced, pacing around the crates as Elsa clung to the steel edges for cover. The helicopter's rotors thundered above, lifting slightly as the pilot prepared to act. Yet on the ice below, the struggle had not ended, and the bear remained only steps away, ready for another strike. The helicopter hovered as the predator circled the field, each heavy step sinking into the crust of snow. Elsa clung tightly to the crate, her body aching from bruises and torn muscles, while the icy wind cut across her face. The flare's glow had faded, leaving smoke drifting into the pale sky. For a moment the animal hesitated, unsettled by the roaring machine above, but its attention returned quickly to the figure crouched below. Instinct urged it to press forward, testing the strange shape trembling against the supplies. As it lunged, Elsa forced herself upward, dragging her frame across the top of the crate. The sharp edges cut into her hands, but the height gave her a slim chance. The pilot, realizing the danger, shifted the helicopter closer, lowering a skid within reach. With effort, Elsa stretched toward the cold metal bar, her body screaming with pain. At that instant, the bear reared and struck, claws raking across her leg, leaving blood that quickly darkened against the snow. Still, she managed to catch the skid, pulling herself upward as the machine lifted, carrying her beyond the immediate reach of the predator. Below, the animal stood glaring, its breath steaming in the frigid air. It paced around the scattered cargo, swiping at boxes and tearing into wrappings, leaving broken wood and plastic across the ice. The crew watched in tense silence, holding their position until the bear finally retreated toward distant ridges, leaving a trail of crushed snow behind. Inside the aircraft, Elsa collapsed, her chest heaving as shock set in. Pain spread from her hip to her ribs, and her leg throbbed with each heartbeat. The cold slowed the bleeding, but her condition remained serious. The helicopter crew secured bandages while radioing for urgent medical aid. Each jolt of turbulence sent fresh waves of agony through her fractured bones, yet she clung to consciousness, unwilling to fade before reaching help. Hours later, she was flown to a small Arctic clinic where doctors treated deep lacerations, stitched torn muscle, and confirmed multiple broken bones. Her parka had been shredded, leaving fabric stiff with frozen stains. The recovery process stretched ahead of her, filled with surgeries, therapy, and months of healing. Survival itself was remarkable, for few who face such power at close distance escape with life. News of the encounter spread quickly, drawing attention from wildlife experts studying the growing risk of polar bears seeking human-related food sources. Researchers explained how scarcity late in the season often drives predators closer to supply camps, stations, and vessels. What had once been rare was becoming more common, a sign of how shifting conditions placed both people and animals into sudden conflict. For Elsa, the memory remained carved into her body and her spirit. Every scar told the story of that day when the silent ice gave way to a sudden charge. Though she had faced storms, seas, and endless nights in frozen lands, nothing equaled the raw force of the bear that nearly ended her work forever. The event became more than a personal trial. It became a lesson to crews across the Arctic that no mission, no matter how routine, could ignore the watchful presence of predators who share the same unforgiving land. On August 14, 2025, in the quiet woods of the Adirondack Mountains, a small lodge stood hidden between tall pines and winding rivers. The owner, Maris Calloway, had lived there for more than 20 years. She was known locally as a woman who loved the forest deeply, running her fishing lodge for travelers and hunters who came to enjoy the lakes and streams. Each season, she prepared hearty meals, kept her cabins warm with carefully stacked firewood, and told visitors stories of the wild landscape surrounding them. Her days were long, yet filled with peace, as she carried out endless chores and welcomed guests who often became lifelong friends. Living far from towns had shaped her into a resilient figure, someone accustomed to silence broken only by wind, rain, or the steady rush of water over stone. Maris had grown up in a nearby village before taking ownership of the lodge her parents once managed. From a young age, she learned to split wood, catch trout, and repair broken tools with her own hands. Her love for the wilderness only deepened with age, though she never underestimated its dangers. Black bears, common in the region, had crossed her path more than once. Usually she saw them from a safe distance, slipping silently across trails or wandering near the lodge at night in search of food scraps. She always kept her supplies locked away and warned visitors about the risks of leaving meals unattended. But even careful habits could be tested, especially when the smell of food carried far on the mountain air. That evening, the scent of smoked fish drifted across the clearing as Maris worked in her kitchen. Outside, a portion of supplies still waited to be stored away. Unnoticed by her, the rich aroma had already reached the keen senses of a bear roaming the nearby forest. The large animal moved silently out of the trees, drawn by hunger and curiosity. Its massive body pressed against the lodge's rear door, and with a sudden crash, the wooden frame splintered. Splinters scattered as the bear forced its way inside, claws gouging into the old floorboards as it entered. Maris turned at the sound, her heart freezing. Before she could react, the bear barreled into the small kitchen, scattering chairs, smashing cabinets, and toppling the heavy wood stove. Pots clattered across the floor, embers spilled from the stove, and the once orderly room descended into chaos. She tried to retreat, but the bear's paw struck with brutal force, slashing through her jacket and tearing into the skin beneath. She stumbled backward into a pile of firewood, gasping as pain surged through her chest and shoulder. The animal pressed forward without hesitation. It lunged again, its jaws closing around her leg. The crushing grip left deep wounds that sent waves of agony through her body. Pinned against the woodpile, she struggled for breath, her body weakening under the sheer weight and power of the attack. Her hands searched desperately for anything within reach. Her fingers brushed against the handle of a cast-iron pan lying near the fallen stove. Summoning every fragment of strength, she lifted it and swung hard. The pan cracked against the bear's skull with a resounding clang. The noise echoed through the broken lodge. The bear staggered back, momentarily stunned, shaking its massive head. Blood streamed from Maris's cuts as she dragged herself toward the corner, where an old radio sat on a low shelf. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, even as the bear turned again, circling the ruined kitchen. The beast lunged once more, claws raking across her legs. She struck again with the pan, hitting its snout, just enough to gain another desperate second. Her hand twisted the radio dial, static filling the air while streaks of blood smeared across the wooden floor. With fading strength, She pressed the call button, sending fragmented signals out into the night. Growls behind her reminded her that her fight was not yet over. She braced herself, convinced the next charge would finish her. But the animal suddenly shifted. With a final low rumble, it turned, retreating through the shattered doorway and fading back into the shadowed forest. The scent of smoke, spilled food, and blood lingered heavily as silence reclaimed the room. Maris slumped against the wall, her breath sharp and uneven. Cuts covered her arms, her shoulder throbbed, and her leg bled steadily from the bite. Around her, the kitchen was unrecognizable. Cabinets splintered, glass shattered, the stove toppled, and the floor littered with wreckage. The smell of iron mixed with ash filled the air. Hours blurred together as she drifted in and out of consciousness, the faint hum of static still whispering from the radio. Rescue came deep into the night. A ranger team arrived after catching her faint signal. They found her collapsed on the floor, weak but alive. They bandaged her wounds quickly and carried her to their vehicle, beginning the long journey to the nearest hospital miles away. Her clothing hung in tatters, soaked with blood, while her body bore the unmistakable marks of teeth and claws. Though her pain was overwhelming, her eyes stayed open, determined to survive. Surgeons worked for hours once she reached the hospital. Deep gashes across her arm and shoulder required dozens of stitches, while her leg needed surgical repair to mend the crushed muscle left by the bite. Broken ribs from the bear's first strike made each breath a struggle. Recovery came slowly, marked by pain and exhaustion, yet her will never faltered. Word of the ordeal spread quickly through the surrounding region. Other lodge owners were cautioned about the danger of leaving food outside, and officials reminded residents that even black bears, though smaller than grizzlies, could cause devastating injuries when emboldened by human scents. The lodge was later repaired, though scars from the attack remained etched into the wooden walls. Maris spent weeks in rehabilitation, learning to walk again while carrying the memory of that night in her body and mind. She knew how close she had come to death, yet she also knew her survival came from quick thinking, raw determination, and the refusal to give in. Morning of July 6, 2025, Harper Lane had trekked deep into the Montana wilderness, her small streaming crew trailing behind as she prepared for a live broadcast that promised to showcase the serene beauty of the forest and the thrill of an intimate encounter with nature. The air was thick with the scent of pine and sun-baked earth, the forest alive with the distant calls of birds and the rustle of unseen animals moving through the underbrush. Harper, a well-known online personality with millions of followers, had long sought to blur the line between adventure and audience engagement, often placing herself in wild environments to bring viewers a sense of immediacy and excitement that no studio could replicate. That day, she moved carefully along a narrow trail, camera in hand, while the soft whir of drones above captured the verdant canopy and the shifting patchwork of sunlight and shadow across moss-covered rocks. Her small crew of 3, assistant Cameron, grip operator Elise, and tech specialist Nolan, followed a few meters behind. Their backpacks carried equipment, emergency supplies, and the small deterrent spray they kept more out of caution than genuine expectation, knowing the unpredictability of Montana's grizzlies during summer foraging. For hours, the forest had seemed unusually still, the usual hum of insects and chatter of birds reduced to distant murmurs. Harper remarked to the camera about the quiet, her tone calm but tinged with a sharp awareness that heightened the tension for her audience. The silence was not one of peace, but of caution, a reminder that these woods were home to creatures larger and far more dangerous than humans. Still, she pressed on with practiced confidence, stepping over roots and ducking under branches, framing her shots with care even under the pressing heat of midday. In the distance, hidden behind a thicket of trees, a massive shadow shifted, unseen by the crew but noticed by the smaller animals of the forest. A predator's eyes tracked the movement, its instincts sharpened by curiosity and hunger. Without warning, a massive grizzly emerged from the tree line, a living wall of muscle and fury, its eyes fixed on the noisy group moving through its territory. Harper's camera jolted as her body reacted instinctively to the shock. The bear charged with astonishing speed, and the forest erupted in chaos. Her crew cried out, their fear raw and frantic. Cameron quickly raised the deterrent spray and unleashed a cloud toward the advancing animal, but its momentum barely faltered. Harper scrambled for footing over roots and loose stones, but her balance failed. The bear struck her with full force, lifting her from the trail and throwing her violently into the undergrowth. She landed hard on a bed of branches and leaves, pain exploding across her shoulder and ribs as the bear swiped again, claws rending her jacket and flesh with terrifying precision. Every movement of the animal was a display of raw, unstoppable power. Its massive paws shredded the ground and hammered against Harper's torso, leaving deep, ragged lacerations across her body. Bruises bloomed in places where the bone itself threatened to give under the crushing blows. Her crew's attempts to intervene were frantic but dangerous. Elise rushed forward, spraying again and waving her arms to distract the animal, while Nolan seized a fallen branch and struck at the bear, each strike a desperate bid to pull its focus away. The fight stretched into minutes that felt impossibly long to anyone watching through a screen, though in reality the struggle lasted only moments packed with unbearable intensity. Harper's mind spun between agony and instinct, her breath ragged as she clawed her way toward a fallen log that might offer some small shelter. Bark scraped her palms, and her legs slipped in blood and sweat. The bear lunged again with terrifying speed, its claws tearing across her thighs and torso, fresh fractures forming under the crushing weight of each blow. The camera captured every detail, streaming the harrowing scene to a horrified audience. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Trees snapped under the animal's weight, leaves and twigs scattering like a storm, the scent of crushed foliage mingling with the metallic tang of blood and adrenaline. Harper's body screamed with pain, her survival instincts narrowed to the singular task of staying alive. The bear's growls and roars reverberated across the dense forest, a sound that shook the ground itself. Her crew, terrified yet unwilling to abandon her, fought with every ounce of determination to distract the predator. Their fear mingled with a grim resolve not to lose the person they had followed into the wilderness. Minutes later, the distant roar of engines and the sharp whistles of approaching officers cut through the forest's chaos. Emergency calls from the crew had reached Montana wildlife authorities, who now moved quickly through the trees. Their arrival forced the Grizzly to retreat into the shadows of the forest, leaving Harper battered, bloodied, and barely conscious. Cameron, Elise, and Nolan rushed to her side, supporting her trembling body as they waited for medics. Soon a helicopter descended, its rotor blades chopping through the treetops. Harper was lifted swiftly into the aircraft and flown to a nearby hospital, where surgeons worked to stabilize her shattered shoulder, fractured ribs, and broken legs. Authorities later moved to remove the live footage from online platforms, citing both the risk of reckless imitation and the need to protect the dignity of what had been streamed. Officials described the attack as a stark reminder of the unpredictability of grizzlies during summer, emphasizing that even seasoned outdoors people could be caught unprepared if signs of animal presence were ignored. When Harper stabilized, she admitted that her pursuit of raw, unfiltered wilderness footage for her audience had nearly cost her everything. The incident became a case study in both wilderness safety and social media responsibility, a sobering example of the risks faced when the drive for content collides with the raw power of the natural world. By the time Harper began her long, painful recovery, the forest had already reclaimed its silence. The thicket where the attack took place seemed ordinary once more, innocent to any passerby. Yet for those who had been there, and for the millions who had seen the broadcast before it was removed, the images endured. They stood as an unshakable reminder of nature's power and the fragility of human presence within it. On the morning of August 3rd, 2023, Tamsin Rourke arrived at a small outdoor music festival near a quiet Vermont town, drawn by the promise of live performances, warm sun, and the hum of a community gathering. The festival spread across a green meadow bordered by dense woodlands, where pine and maple trees swayed in the summer breeze, and a nearby brook murmured softly over mossy rocks. Tamsin, a young woman who loved music, and the occasional weekend escape from city life, wove her way through clusters of festival-goers carrying picnic baskets, coolers, and folding chairs. She wore a light jacket tied around her waist and sneakers that had seen better days. Her bag slung across her shoulder, filled with snacks, water, and a small camera she occasionally raised to capture the lively scenes. The air carried the scent of grilled food, sunscreen, and damp grass, a combination that spoke of summer leisure, but also masked a danger lying just beyond the tree line. For hours, the festival moved at a relaxed pace. People laughed and danced, children ran in circles, and music floated across the fields in rhythmic waves. Tamsin lingered near a cluster of picnic tables where families had left plates of food and scraps, the remnants of a barbecue scattered in cheerful messiness. The sound of clinking bottles and the occasional bark of a dog mingled with guitar riffs and drum beats, creating an atmosphere of comfort and familiarity. Yet somewhere in the thick forest beyond the fields, a black bear, large and increasingly accustomed to human presence, had caught the scent of leftover food. Drawn forward by hunger and curiosity, it moved silently through the underbrush, its dark fur blending with shadows, muscles shifting with quiet precision as it approached the meadow's edge. Tamsin was the first to notice something unusual, a shadow moving unnaturally fast across the grass. At first, she thought it might be a volunteer rushing to adjust equipment or a jogger passing through. But then the shape became unmistakable. A bear broke from the tree line with sudden speed, its powerful legs propelling it toward the unsuspecting crowd. Screams erupted instantly, the atmosphere of music and chatter collapsing into chaos and confusion. Tamsin's heart pounded as she realized the scale of the threat, adrenaline surging as she turned to flee across the damp, uneven grass, still slick from morning dew and the previous day's rain. As she ran, her foot slipped, and she fell hard onto the ground. The bear was upon her within seconds, its massive paw striking in a blur that tore through her arm and thigh. Pain seared across her body as deep lacerations opened and puncture wounds formed where claws had connected. The meadow, once cheerful and bright, seemed to shrink around her, the sound of music fading into a distant echo as the bear's growls filled her immediate awareness. Each movement became a desperate negotiation with survival, her mind racing for anything that could serve as a barrier or weapon. Her hands scrabbled against the grass until they found a folding chair, its aluminum frame light yet solid enough to provide a fragile defense. She gripped it with both hands, swinging and jabbing as the bear lunged again, teeth bared, claws outstretched, eyes locked on her body. The swipes tore into the chair with a sickening screech of metal, and every motion demanded strength she could barely muster. Sweat and blood stung her eyes as she swung with frantic precision, striking the animal's muzzle and forcing it backward step by step. Each impact was a contest of willpower and exhaustion, the fragile chair pitted against raw power. Finally, the bear retreated behind a low fence at the meadow's edge, snarling but withdrawing into the shadows. Around her, festival-goers stood frozen in shock. Some screamed, others ran for cover, and a few rushed to aid those nearest to danger. Emergency calls went out immediately. Soon, the distant hum of helicopter blades grew louder, signaling the approach of professional responders. Tamsin, pale and trembling, clung to consciousness as rescuers carefully lifted her onto a stretcher. Her body was battered and bloodied, yet she was alive. Within minutes, she was airlifted to a hospital where surgeons worked to close deep wounds and repair the damage to muscle, nerve, and skin. Officials investigating the incident later found clear evidence that the bear had become habituated to human food, drawn not only by scent, but also by repeated exposure to scraps left in areas frequented by people. Its behavior, while alarming, was not unusual for a wild animal conditioned to seek food near humans. The findings highlighted the dangers of negligence, unattended grills, discarded scraps, or open trash, small oversights that can lure predators into close contact with humans and lead to life-threatening encounters. Tamsin's story spread widely, becoming a stark reminder that human recreation in natural spaces must always acknowledge the presence of wildlife. The event underscored the fragile boundary between leisure and danger, a line that can vanish without warning. Her experience illustrated how quickly a community gathering, built on music and joy, could transform into a fight for survival when the wild intersected with human carelessness. In the weeks that followed, Tamsin recovered slowly. Her body carried the scars of the encounter, each mark a reminder of vulnerability and resilience. She reflected privately on the lessons learned, the fragility of human presence in the wild, and the narrow space between safety and peril. Festival organizers reviewed their safety protocols, implementing stricter waste management and clearer warning systems. Wildlife officials reinforced public education campaigns, urging greater awareness when gathering near habitats where bears and other large predators roam. The meadow itself returned to peace, the scent of pine and summer grass replacing the metallic tang of blood. Music festivals resumed under stricter oversight, the laughter and rhythms restored. Yet for Tamsin, the memory of that August morning remained vivid. The slip on wet grass, the flash of claws, the sting of blood, and the desperate struggle to hold off a predator with nothing more than a folding chair and sheer determination. The incident became both a cautionary tale and a testament to survival, a reminder that even in spaces designed for human enjoyment, the wild remains untamed, capable of sudden, terrifying force. Tamsin's endurance under pressure and her ability to fight back against overwhelming odds ensured her survival. But the memory of that day would always stand as a sharp reminder of nature's unpredictability and the delicate balance between human activity and wilderness.